Throughout my life, I would have always considered myself as restrained. I clung to rules and moral codes, always listened to authority. So when my grandma said that mentally ill people were attention seeking at the dinner table one day, I believed that. Why wouldn't I? My grandma dropped out of school at second grade, spent every day herding bulls up the Fujianese mountains, and still managed to persevere regardless of grueling injuries and an incredible amount of losses. She learned how to drown her sick baby siblings in lakes before she learned how to read or write. It was simple. If you weren't strong enough, you were better off dead. My grandma tries to constantly instill these values of toughing it out in me during my childhood, often calling me worthless and telling me that unless I stopped being weak and emotional, no one would ever love me. So every time I wanted to complain, I bit my tongue. I always insisted I was fine and never stepped out of its line, defining an ordinary human. Then I tried to take my own life. I had struggled with mental health for many years, but that was the first time I actually did something about it. I knew I had problems, yet I couldn't bring it up in fear of being shamed. I didn't want to be seen as less capable. I swore to myself that I never disappoint my grandma, my sole caretaker, by succumbing to incompetence. But one mistake cost me everything. I crossed the line of no return, and it was too late for me to go back to the way I was. In the emergency room, I was at the lowest point of my life. My soul felt disconnected from my body, like a power cord severed. I couldn't really feel any physical pain. Even when the nurse messed up inserting my IV and splattered my blood across the hospital bed, all I felt was a sense of emptiness. The crimson staining my sheets reminded me of the unfortunate truth. I was alive. I remained silent and unmoving as my grandma broke down crying, blaming me for upsetting my dad, for making her have to come here, and for tearing the family apart. If I had just been stronger, if I hadn't been so selfish, then I wouldn't have ruined everything for everyone. If I was braver, then maybe I would have actually succeeded in my attempts. Those were the words running through my head as my grandma told me that I should have just finished myself off. I thought my mental state couldn't get any worse, yet I couldn't have been less prepared for the next 2 weeks of my life. By the end of the same night, the doctor suggested that I sign myself into a mental hospital. I blindly agreed because she reassured me that the staff would do everything in their power to help me, and for once I had hoped that things would improve. The only previous knowledge I had on these institutions was from my younger cousin, who was sent for behavior issues and slower mental development. However, her mother and my grandma ended up pulling her out, since she was physically disciplined, verbally abused, and would cry every time either of them visited. The guilt ate my grandma alive, yet she had no objection to me being sent there. Maybe she wanted me to suffer the same damage I had done unto her, but regardless, I would never forget how the place that was meant to help me heal only worsened my depression and failed me as a patient. The first thing I heard when I arrived in my unit was the loud and heavy slam of someone being thrown against the hardwood floor. As I turned the corner and was led into a dimly lit hallway, my eyes were welcomed by the sight of a girl writhing on the ground in pain, and my ears were graced by screams of agony and choruses of cold stone command from the staff. The nurse who was leading me turned a blind eye and barely acknowledged the situation. I was simply told to stay in my room, and as the door closed, I felt a sense of uneasiness wash over me like a tidal wave. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, in the pants and shirt too large, and in the room too devoid and empty to provide solace. I only got to sleep 5 hours before I was woken up by obnoxious knocking, followed by a lesson from a senior staff member. "Just shut up and be quiet," was what he said. "That's how you manage to leave this place." So I did. I barely talked to anyone, slept through a good majority of my days, and dissociated through group therapy sessions. I faded into the background, and soon I began to get treated as salvageable, just because I was complacent. I merely observed as other patients and staff went at each other like wild dogs. The patients might as well could have been considered dogs, since they were literally being treated like animals. I can't even remember the amount of times patients were dehumanized, called unfixable, and had their own trauma used against them. "This is exactly why none of your family wants you back home," or "This is why your dad doesn't visit," was one of the many things I heard. It only made the rates of fights and outbursts increase. I tried to tune out all the yelling, but I couldn't ignore the sight of it. children having meltdowns, staff responding with hostility and scolding, ceiling tiles being torn out, chairs being thrown, kids being dragged out and administered with anesthesia, cracks in the wall from punches. I could go on and on about incidents for the rest of this speech. But in the midst of everything was just a teenage girl hugging her chemistry book in the corner, because I couldn't touch anyone else, and that was the only thing I was allowed back. It was the only unaltered possession I held, the only reminder of who I used to be before I couldn't even have laces on my sneakers and strings in my jacket. As my examination day loomed closer, I began to feel unbelievably numb to the world. The days faded into one, and the only structure I had was around meal times. We were rotated through our schedules like prisoners, but I didn't ever complain, because complaining meant extra time here. After 4 days that felt like centuries, I talked to the doctor. He told me to stay another week because of the circumstances of my attempts. After being repeatedly told by staff I'd probably get out within a few days, I had all my hopes crushed by a doctor who should have been at work the first day I was here. As I watched another patient leave the same day I received my death sentence, I cried for the first time in ages. I laid at the end of the hallway, sobbing on the floor. No staff member came to check on me. When I cried again later that day during mealtime, the only thing I heard from staff was to stop causing a scene. It made me realize I was not immune to being a victim to verbal abuse, whether I was quiet or not. The hospital system undoubtedly aimed to reprimand kids for having emotions instead of actually helping them heal. The goal was to control us, not to address the long-term issues or even try to fix them. The staff only wanted to patch up temporary problems just so their unit could pass the check. The patients meant nothing. By that point, I gave up even speaking to them. Near the end of my stay, my grandma decided to visit me. The patients were allowed nightly calls, but I hadn't used any for her. Maybe the radio silence had changed something, because the first thing she said when she saw me was, "I'm sorry." My grandma had never apologized to me ever in life. She was loud, courageous, headstrong, and so deeply unapologetic to everyone. In the cafeteria the staff used as a meeting room, she took her hands in mine and said my dad made her realize how wrong she was, and from now on, she would change how she treats me. I didn't respond at first. For the longest time in my life, I waited for something like this from her. For her to prioritize me, to put me first, and to finally recognize my efforts. Then I realized something. After chasing for my grandma's approval for so long, I finally didn't need it anymore. I didn't want her validation. I had been through so much at that point where small things that bothered me in the past didn't seem to matter as much. I simply just didn't care as much as I did before. We spent the rest of the time talking, but I never accepted her apology. My grandma changing, though, gave me the hope that I could change. I just needed to find the validation within myself. Leaving the hospital opened the door for my mental health to improve. Being there stunted my growth completely, and as my dad drove me away, I felt helpless towards the rest of the patients who would never get released or who kept getting admitted again and again because the hospital system set them up for failure and didn't help them in the slightest. Nonetheless, I couldn't do anything about it back then. The next chapter of my life starts with me moving to Florida shortly after the worst hospital vacation ever. I thought my new school would be a fresh start for me, but it was like I stepped into version 2 of the mental hospital. Students fought constantly, and teachers turned a blind eye. When 2 students chased a girl into her classroom and hunted her down, my teacher even laughed, like it was a source of entertainment. The 3rd week, a kid brought a knife to school and started threatening students with it. Every day, there was a small fear I'd be targeted, and I was. Students threw stuff at me, even physically hitting me. I was socially isolated. There wasn't one moment there where I could get peace, quiet, and safety. Combined with my unstable, still recovering mental health, it put me in a bad state. Although I was extremely excited and energetic the first day, that optimism drained out of me. I suddenly understood why the school attendance was so low. Each day I lost hope in my teachers and staff. They didn't see us as humans, but animals that needed to be controlled. They constantly demeaned us by assuming the worst and wielding their suspicions like weapons. I lost count of how many times they instigated random students in the hallways, but ignored teens brawling and ripping each other's hairs out 6 feet away. Then, I looked at the broader picture. Students fought and lashed out, yet the school rarely did anything to fix the root cause of student unease, safety concerns, and poor school spirit. The administrative board was slow to act and opted for temporary solutions instead of effective ones. It awfully reminded me of how the mental system works. I wondered if the students here feared voicing their emotions because the school system too punished the students first for addressing the real problems. The environment only worsened as issues went unchecked, and as someone who was put in the same situation before, I want to actually do something about these problems now because I finally recognize the severity of this ignorance and neglect. There are going to be so many repeat visits at the mental hospital and so many repeat fights at school if these systems work to uplift and better students instead of doing the bare minimum to keep their institutions afloat. Both these places should be a safe place for self-improvement and growth, and it pains me to admit that they oftentimes aren't. No recently released patient like me could heal in a chaotic and hostile school environment without strong external help. That's why I want to bring my communities together through peer support groups, buddy-buddy, and big sibling programs. Because there aren't many places for students to go during lunch to escape the noise, and there are no clubs that happen after school, I want to designate specific rooms and times for students as a safe place. Though a staff member, preferably a counselor, would be there to supervise it, I want to empower students to lead the meeting and speak their honest truth. This could be a chance for students to just talk about their own issues without fear of judgment. The reason why so many people avoid the counselors is because of the generational difference and often old-fashioned mindsets. Being in a group of people from the same generation can foster more comfortability and community connection. As for buddy-buddy and big sibling programs, they specifically target new upcoming or transfer students, but can be open towards all. Via buddy-buddy programs, you can pair up with a student of your own grade, so you'll have many of the same subjects, and via big sibling programs, you can connect with an upperclassman for advice and guidance. The main difference would be the upperclassmen in the big sibling programs are receiving volunteer hours, since that is a requirement to graduate in my school and is used for the very popular Florida Bright Future Scholarship. So while upperclassmen benefit from hours, participants with the Buddy Buddy program can gain a friend who will be able to study with them since they share the same classes. In short, people in my community will be encouraged to branch out to others more. All these programs combined can contribute to a better community engagement, increased attendance, and a more welcoming environment, hopefully less fights and tussles that students can actually thrive in. This project means so much to me because not only do I believe my school can change, I can change too. I will change. Even if the admin board pushes these programs back, I will continue to fight for the implementation until I graduate. I don't plan to be complacent just because an authority figure tells me to. I won't step down and be quiet. I will use my voice, even if it isn't wanted, because if I can at least save one student's life, it will all be worth it. Because I know that me back then would have also wanted someone to reach out to me like that.